Thank you for letting me have the last word. Quite, not quite. What I normally do is always data-driven, so now I decided no slides, just to give you my impression from all my work in research in the sector and my conversations with you and the presentations today, what I would think about if I'm thinking forward about the sector. I really like Susan's metaphor of the rocky shores. This is where I think we're heading, and we need to be very careful. Now I like her metaphor of Uber even better, and that's a very nice one. So yes, first of all, where are we heading? We know there are lots of disruptions now, and all of the changes are actually accelerating, that everything, the innovations are exponential. They're no longer slowly, incrementally building on one another. They are very disruptive and very incremental. They're no longer incremental. If you take disruptive technologies and think about it in terms of the nonprofit sector, philanthropy and philanthropic activity, you can't help but saying that the traditional ways of philanthropic activity are past. We must address the fact the internet is around us every which way, both in giving us information and also allowing us to participate in activities. So from cyber philanthropy, people now donate online with the press of a button. We need to have people access our organizations, our platforms much easily. We need to be aware of what's happening in social media, what people are reporting about our organizations, our philanthropic activities. We need to know new ways of funding. Crowdfunding is something enormous that philanthropic organizations are just getting a handle on. In fact, at one point when I didn't get a research grant for one of my research pet projects, I thought of going crowdfunding. So I approached my organization, my university, thinking, I have a great idea, only to find out that people have been doing this for the last 3 years, and the university had a protocol already in place for crowdfunding for research. So things are moving very rapidly and very fast in this space. And the last thing is that there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity in the philanthropic sphere. There's always been. We know that nonprofits are much more entrepreneurial and innovative and so on, but this is also accelerating in a sense that all the boundaries that we respected between the for-profit, non-profit, and the public sector are completely blurred now. You can not just only collaborate, you can't just only have a hierarchical relationship. The relationships are being turned upside down in terms of sector blurring. And so they're no longer just governments contracting out to nonprofits, but they're looking at them as partners, they're looking at them as incubators, they're looking at them as providing very important policy feedbacks to government. Similarly with the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector, very much blurring of the sectors. In fact, if you open up a website of a large corporation, it looks like as though it's a non-profit. It's telling us what it's doing for the community, its public outreach, etc., and etc. If you open up the page of a non-profit, suddenly talking about effectiveness, impact, in the sectors are blurring even in their messages that they're giving to the public. So we need to pay attention to how we are positioning ourselves in what we thought of a three-sector world as a much more less sectoral, but much more blurring of all the sectors in the thing. Another thing that I would think about when I'm thinking about philanthropic activity and moving forward is the diversity in not only the givers, but in the ways of giving. This has changed drastically from the traditional volunteer who came to your organization and said, I have so many hours, give me a task, to all kinds of volunteering which are like coming episodic. This is the growth of the modern volunteer, is that they will come to you for a specific course, for a specific number of days or hours, and you need to use them. I'm working with engineers developing plans to use spontaneous volunteers who appear disastrous. I mean, this has always been the case, but much more of the giving of time has become spontaneous and episodic and very instrumental to the giver. So as Susan says very rightly, you got to be careful of who your suppliers are. And if the lives of your suppliers are changing, you need to change your output to match what you're getting. And I'll just give you an example. I often volunteer at the Ronald McDonald's House in Philadelphia, and they provide a meal every single day to their people who live in the Ronald McDonald House. Is this something you have in Quebec? So you're familiar with it. So this is where people come and stay there when their children are in hospital. How do you get a meal 365 days of a year? You can't rely on volunteers alone in the traditional form. So they opened it up and they allowed groups to come in just once a year. They give you basic rules of what you need to do, and then you're left on your own. So people donate the food, come and cook the food, and food is there for the families, which are 60 to 80 people, every single day. They change their mode of giving it based on suppliers. No volunteer wants to commit themselves for once a week for 52 weeks. They couldn't get that. They had to change their model of operation to the new changing supply of volunteers. I expect that this will be true in giving as well. And there is no reason that we only have to go for big gifts. We can go for a $2 gift, but if you get enough $2 gifts, this is a huge attached donation, if you will, non-dedicated donations that your organizations can do a lot with. But we need to change our focus on and use the internet to our advantage. There's also diversity in the people who give, as mentioned by the earlier speakers. They're getting younger, they're more likely to be female, different ethnicities. Immigrant groups are very involved in giving, both time and money. We need to know how to involve them and engage them in the organizations. In one of our research studies of immigrant communities across Canada, we found it was so important to them to have places to go. You don't come in from a different country and know automatically that you can go to the art museum and volunteer. If you set up the opportunities for different groups of people, you're more likely to engage them in both giving and time. But we need to set up the opportunities, be responsive to who our suppliers are in terms of giving both time and money. As other of the speakers mentioned, the critique of philanthropy is going to grow. There is no question that taxpayers are becoming very savvy, and as one of the meetings at the foundation leader says, well, the staff was telling him, you need to do this, this, and this. And he said, well, it's my money. I'm going to do what I want. And somebody in the staff said, no, it's not your money. It's taxpayers' money. And, of course, he was fired, but but it underlines the point that people are becoming very savvy, that it's not just the donor's money, and donors can't simply call the tune all of the time, and that taxpayers are going to get more involved and raise bigger questions about tax breaks. There are people who are saying, well, why don't we get rid of the tax incentive altogether? This is not very good news for nonprofits, because we believe that the tax incentives generate a lot more giving. At the same time, the question is, how are the public involved in this public good? And how much are the public involved in the public good? And as I gave you earlier, the Gates Foundation, how are the public involved that billions of dollars that the federal government in the US forgo because of Bill Gates' donations, his foundation, how are they involved in democratically choosing where that money is spent? And this is a thing that's going to raise its head over and over and over again. So the tax breaks. There are other subsidies. For example, most universities, and I can talk of my own, don't pay property tax. We're a huge Ivy League, hugely endowed university, and we don't pay property taxes. How does that make sense to our surrounding communities? And if you've been to Philadelphia, the area around my university is gorgeous, but 10 blocks down the road, they're broken down houses, schools are not functioning, and the taxpayers are saying, what is the public good? The university, which is a non-profit, it doesn't pay property taxes. Now, of course, my president would say, well, we're the largest employer in the city. Well, you don't give all large employers a break, right? But what is the public good? And these are the kind of questions that are not going away. I would argue they would become even more insistent. So it behooves organizations who are not paying property taxes, who are getting tax breaks, to be much more, as Susan said, transparent and accountable to the public, and not just their big donors, because the public are part of your donors. They forego the taxes that the donors give. There is actually, I'm going to take a slightly different view on small foundations, because the argument is, small foundations are not impactful, they don't do much. But one of the speakers at the conference I was suggested that actually small foundations do a lot. Even though they're small and they don't have the scaling up, think about it. Every small foundation has to have a board. They rely more heavily on volunteers than the large foundation that rely on paid. So think of the ripple effects in the community in terms of the social capital being generated by so many people being involved in decisions. And decisions, when they're made small, if they go wrong, well, it's one small foundation that went wrong, not the scaled up large foundation that messed up. So there are arguments on both sides. I agree with some of the arguments made on the large foundations and being very wary of them and getting rid of them, as some people argue. Getting rid of the small foundations, just keeping the big ones because they're impactful. But on the other hand, and don't forget I'm an economist, so I always look at the other hand, small foundations also have a very important role to play at the grassroots level to keep the community engaged. They're actually, the boards are your ambassadors for philanthropic activity in your large community. And more board members, more people engaged, this is your civil society. So I'd be a little shy of getting rid of those small foundations in a hurry. And the last point I want to make is the public perception of our sector and of philanthropic activity. I have learned over the years that how you frame what you do is significant. I have also learned that people, and this was a study done in Toronto, don't really even recognize the nonprofit sector, don't even know the organizations they work in are sometimes registered nonprofits. People simply don't know what we think is self-evident. No, but if you think about it, nonprofits is just a tax code. It's only a tax thing. And most people are not thinking, what is the CRA doing or what is the IRS thinking? They look at the organization and they don't necessarily see it as a nonprofit. We don't do a good job in telling people that we are charitable organizations. We do something on the public good. I would like the first page of every organization to open up and say, yes, we're a nonprofit organization. This is our mission. And we have a charitable status or not, depending whether you have. But we have very little information. So in our study, when we did it, I think close to 30% of the frontline staff of the 30 organizations we had did not know their organization was a nonprofit or a registered charity. So how do we expect people in the public to know it? So we need to think about what are the good signals that we have, or shortcuts, a way of communicating what your organization does, so that everybody walking around knows you're a charitable organization. They know that about Red Cross, they knew that about United Way, but the rest of them, very few people knew that the universities they were attending, so this was a student sample, were nonprofits. They thought the universities, University of Toronto, Rice, and York University, were for-profit organizations. We're doing a terrible job if you're not even telling our students what kind of organization we're running. So I think that going forward, we need to make that a very big point of saying who we are, celebrating who we are, celebrating our philanthropic activity, and taking ownership of what we do. So those are my sort of parting words. Thank you very much.